the legal knowledge and legal capability of citizens. So I help design in-person trainings, webinar, podcasts, educational materials, and even panels such as this one. Also, as part of my job at Educalois, I brought together about 15 organizations to establish a community of practice on legal education in Quebec. And I do have another really important titles. I am a mother of many kids. So I have two young daughters, and I have also 50 plants. And I take care of Boris, Doris, and Mario as well, who are my bicycles, sorry. And my actually, they don't require all the same level of care, but they all need some love. So that's for my bio.
That's great, Isabel. I love that. That's fantastic. Okay, and can we get Paula? Why don't you go next?
Thank you so much, Hannah. My name is Paula Price, and I work at the People's Law School in Vancouver, BC. For anybody who is not familiar with the People's Law School, they provide legal information to members of the public, and that information is to help them resolve their everyday legal problems. So from employment to wills and estates to buying a used car, those are the topics that we like to cover. The People's Law School has a long history since the 1970s of doing in-person classes to share that legal information with members of the public. And I was brought in at the end of 2019 to help develop a webinar program to help supplement those in-person classes. And the pandemic struck, of course, in March 2020, and all of a sudden everything went online. And so we were conveniently positioned to launch into our webinar programming ahead of schedule. We started out by creating a webinar for to cover employment questions because that was really topical at the time. And we've been developing our webinar programming ever since. So I'm very excited to be sharing some of what we've learned along the way with all of you. I'm excited to learn from all the other speakers in terms of their experiences. Joel, I noticed in the comments that you're talking about humor and entertainment. We hope that today's webinar provides those things to you. Delighted to be here with the other speakers and delighted to be here with all the participants. We can't see you, but delighted to see you there, delighted to see your comments in the chat, and very excited for today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was really well said. And Amber, let's hear your end here.
Sure. Hi. Thanks very much, Hannah. My name's Amber Chisholm. I'm a lawyer working in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and my current title with Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick is as their acting associate director. So here at PLEAC, our mandate is to educate the public about the law, and we do that through a great deal of resources, be them printed or online, as well as through webinars and workshops on various aspects of the law. Right now, we have workshops on multiple areas of family law, as well as on sexual harassment in the workplace. And I oversee the development and the delivery of a good deal of our projects. Outside of work, I'm also a founding member of a local association here for LGBTQIA youth and young adults, and I organize some information clinics and ID clinics through them and through Pro Bono Students Canada. I'm really excited to hear what all the other speakers have to say here today, and that's all I have to say about me.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you to everyone here. Obviously, we have some fantastic panelists here, so thanks for those introductions again. And I'm just going to add quickly just a few housekeeping notes as well before we get started. So please submit any questions you have today using the Q&A button below. The panelists will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, and I will be reading those aloud from the Q&A specific section. And finally, as well, today's session is being recorded and will be distributed after the webinar is complete. And there's also a very brief survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a minute out of your day to just complete it and help us continue to improve our programming. So that's sort of it in terms of our introduction here. Let's jump right in. So I'm just going to share our sort of part one here before the webinar. So to our panelists, what are the key considerations for preparing a webinar? Paula, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And I forgot to mention in the intro, I am a lawyer. I have a background in commercial litigation. 2 young kids, no plants. Isabel holds she's the reigning champion here. What I wanted to talk about and share with you is the the steps that we take prior to having the webinar to get the webinar ready. And so I'm just going to focus on marketing and who is in attendance. And I've got 5 points I'm going to cover. I'm going to try to do that relatively efficiently. So the first is to pick a topic for your webinar that responds to a real need. And that may be driven by funding. Maybe you've been asked to put on a webinar on a particular topic. It may be that you have free reign over what it is that you're talking about. And when we pick our topics, we like to go to a number of sources to decide on the topic. I'll just mention a couple here. One is data. So we have the benefit of information that comes from the People's Law School website. We can see where the heaviest traffic is. For example, maybe it's fences and neighbors, wills and estates, probate. These are areas where people are very interested in those web pages. And we also have a Q&A service where people write in with questions. And so we're able to track and look at those questions and see where most questions are coming through. So we can use data to decide what topics we're going to cover and how we're going to frame our webinars to respond to those needs. Another source you might look at is what's happening in the real world. So I mentioned in the intro, when the pandemic struck, there were a lot of people who were struggling with their employment situation. So we were able to deliver a webinar that responded to a very current need. We had another webinar earlier this year when the Divorce Act was updated. So that was something that we knew people were interested in knowing what kind of impact that would have on them. So that's the first thing, is to think about what people need. The second is to identify who it is that you're trying to reach. And it may be that you're trying to reach more than one group of person. For us, we are often, typically our primary audience is the people who we're trying to reach with the information, people, individuals, non-lawyers who have a problem, like how do I do a probate, or what happens if I buy a used car and it's a lemon. And I see my time is almost up and I barely started, so I'll rush through this. So is it them or is it the people who help them? The third is to figure out how you're going to reach them. So this really is the marketing. We use our email list. We use Zoom, which you need to register for. So that helps us to gather new emails to bring new people onto our list. So we've been able to bring more people into our community, and we can then tell them about future webinars and other offerings that we have. Social media, collaborators. So if you have a webinar and you know other organizations are interested, we share that with them so they can share it with their audience. If you have a speaker who has a social media following or an email list of their own, that helps also to share information about the webinar. And sometimes you might time your webinar to coincide with an external event. So for example, in BC, Make a Will Week is coming up first week of October. So we're launching a wills and estates and planning trilogy that week. Last 2 points is the speaker, not so much marketing, but the who. You want to pick somebody who is engaging, somebody who can relate to the people that you're trying to reach, and who has, in our case, we look for people who have experience talking to non-lawyers. And then finally, just be clear in your marketing messaging. And so we like to have in the language the problems that you're going to be addressing, so that anyone who might be interested in the topic can identify themselves as, oh yeah, that's a topic that I'm interested in signing up for. So I'm sorry, I'm sure I went over time. Back to you, Hannah.
No problem, Paula. I know this. This is how it goes, right? With webinar programming. No, but thank you. That's perfect. So, Isabel, did you want to add to that?
Yeah. So the first key consideration I would like to highlight is simple, is pedagogy, which is my expertise. So pedagogy, it's an approach that guides the facilitation of webinars. It helps find the best strategies to maximize the learning, because that's what you want with your webinars. And a well-designed workshop will motivate participants to learn even more and apply what they learn in their daily lives or at work. So there are 5 easy steps of instructional design you can follow to prepare your webinar. So the first one is to set the training objectives. Actually, we always need to know where we are going before deciding how to get there. So the training objective should fill in the statement, like this statement, like by the end of the webinar, people would be able to. For instance, we started by asking ourselves what we wanted to achieve with this webinar. So by the end of this webinar, you should be able to identify about 10 best practices to design and facilitate legal information webinars, so that you should achieve. So the second step would be to determine and structure the content. The third one would be to identify training techniques. We will talk about the different training techniques later on in the second part of this panel, so stay tuned. One of the most important one is the step 4. So prepare a training outline. Maybe some of you only prepare the webinar's legal content. Maybe some of you prepare a PowerPoint presentation with notes. Maybe some don't prepare at all, convinced that you master the subject. Good for you. I want you to realize how essential a training outline is for structuring your webinar content. Training outline is not just a PowerPoint presentation with notes. It should specify when and how you will invite people to participate, when and how you will share your content, and when and how you will reinforce participants' learning. Training outline can include an icebreaker, some very short lecture type segments, participatory activities, small group discussion, recaps, etc. And in fact, we even prepared a training outline for this webinar. We wanted to make sure we would apply the best practices we're going to share with you today. And so the last and not the least step of instructional design is to prepare logistics and training materials. So this might be like the last step, but is one of the most important one. So if you're well prepared, you will prevent problems and you'll easily overcome unforeseen events. And you probably know that with technology, you probably face many problems. So here's some advice, like make sure to check your internet connection, familiarize yourself with the webinar platform features, test your microphone and camera beforehand. And more than anything, practice. I suggest to practice 1 or even 2 times with a colleague, with your family, I don't know, before the live webinar. Yep.
That's great. Thank you so much, Isabel. Amber, go ahead and chime in.
Great. Yeah. So something really important that we consider at PLEAC when we're developing a webinar is our goal of providing clear, plain language materials to the public. And plain language means language that's clear, it's simple, and it's easy to understand as completely as possible the first time that it's shared. So I think that this needs to involve at least 2 things. First, giving your audience a roadmap or an overview upfront of the material they're going to be learning. And then also making sure that you and your audience actually have a shared and common vocabulary. So starting with the overview of the subject matter, giving a clear timeline so that folks have a good grasp of the schedule for the session and what they can expect to learn and in what order is a really great way to start off early. It identifies key concepts early on so that people are able to fit the knowledge that they're gaining into a larger framework as they go. It also means establishing that common understanding for key terms. So that's that second component. This can be done by, say, sharing a glossary at the beginning of your presentation, even as a handout that participants can access separately or print off themselves. Defining all those key terms is really crucial, especially when you're developing an educational content about the law to the wider public, because we can sometimes take for granted what people do and don't know about these terms and what they mean. Definitions should be short and simple and get to the heart of the term's purpose in the context of this specific webinar. So for example, if I'm developing a webinar on wills and estates, I'm going to want to really simply define the word intestate and intestacy really early on so that every single time it's mentioned throughout, people know exactly what I mean when I'm referring to that word. In some cases, though, it might even be better to avoid the legal term altogether or maybe define it once and then avoid it. So for example, if I'm doing a webinar on child support, I probably don't want to use pro rata every time and instead use words like shared according to their incomes. So note there that like shorter isn't always simpler, especially when it comes to legal jargon that isn't always used outside of the legal context. In a webinar on harassment in the workplace and on labor and employment law, it's going to be really necessary to give legal definitions of harassment while also being clear and acknowledging that this definition has been narrowed to suit our purpose for labor relations, and it's not going to have the same definition in different legal or social circumstances. A final note too, it can be really helpful to prepare by putting some thought into your own persona as a facilitator if you're the one delivering the webinar. Your relatability factor as a facilitator can often go a really long way in making your audience feel comfortable, at ease, and ready to learn and engage with the material. So some things I like to do when I'm writing my speaking notes is to write them out ahead of time so that I'm not left scrambling to make comments off the cuff if I lose my way or I get turned around. I also make sure as often as possible to add some kind of joke, maybe with a self-deprecating tone near the beginning or in my bio. I think both Paula and Isabel demonstrated this really well earlier. This helps break the ice from the get-go, and it shifts the power differential between the speaker and the audience to try and make us all feel like we're here to learn and share. Some people are going to take different approaches, so this is a lot more about going to be for each facilitator, because it's mostly about focusing on being comfortable in your own shoes in front of an audience and projecting that confidence outwards in a way that helps your audience be receptive to what you're sharing with them.
Perfect. That's some fantastic advice here already for our first part for before the webinar. So we're going to move right into part 2 because we are on a time crunch. Let's jump right in to the next question, which is, what are the best ways to keep people's attention or keep people engaged during a webinar? Or in other words, how do you spark interest in the topic and reinforce learned knowledge and skills? Let's hear from Amber first.
Great. So what I'm going to talk about here is the importance of using the tools that are available for you to you through the program itself, and to plan for them in advance. So we use Zoom for most of our workshops, so that's what I'm going to be discussing here today. We find it often helps a lot to have support in the form of a moderator. The moderator can go in and set up your sessions ahead of time. When you're setting up the session, you can also preset a number of things. So we rely on breakout rooms and polls a lot to keep the audience engaged and to make sure that the session has a little bit of variety to it. These really should be set up in advance to make sure that everything runs smoothly, but some of them can be done on the fly. Your options for these kinds of tools are going to depend on what kind of software you're using. Again, so I'm going to be talking about Zoom, but Microsoft Teams is going to be different. And the licensing you have will also affect this. So polls, for example, are only available on the paid Zoom account. Breakout rooms, they essentially function as a stand-in for the portion in an in-person meeting where you have people break up into small groups and talk to their neighbors about a particular question. It keeps the audience engaged, and it introduces that social element, which is often lost when you have online meetings. So it can also help to let participants know from the get-go, maybe in that roadmap that I suggested earlier, that they're going to be separated into breakout rooms. That way they can anticipate the conversation, and it also signals them to pay attention because they might be expected to discuss the content with others. But it also kind of gives them the chance to prepare, because if they're going to be socializing with people they don't know, it'll help for them to know to anticipate that. To set up a breakout room, you basically just need to go into your Zoom settings and enable them. And you can set them up in advance, as many as you like, but then during the meeting as well, you can go into the breakout room sessions and change the number as necessary. You can ask Zoom to assign the rooms to attendees automatically, or you can add them to each room's list yourself manually. There is this function where you can allow attendees to choose their room, and that might be useful for some kinds of webinars where you might want to break people up according to their particular skill set, for example. Just be aware that if you do it that way, you'll have to disable the option that allows participants to then hop between rooms at will. You use that same menu to put participants into their respective rooms as well, and it'll prompt them with a pop-up allowing them to enter the room. Once there, you can share your screen to the room, so that will give you the chance to give them a visual reminder of any discussion question you might have given them. And it also, there's an option to let participants see a countdown of how much time you have left. The polls are also a really good option for a few reasons. First, they're a really easy, low stress way to engage with the material. So maybe if somebody isn't comfortable speaking up or even turning on their camera, answering a poll pop-up is quick and simple, and it helps the facilitator do things like gauge the participants' current understanding of a subject. A poll early on with a really simple and easy question, something even as innocuous as "how are you feeling today," can be a really good way to get people comfortable and engaging early on, again, with low commitment from the participants. It gets them used to the software, sets them up with the expectation that they're going to be asked questions throughout, but be careful not to make it too poll heavy, because that can become really tedious. So I would suggest, again, that first question be really simple and easy. All you have to do is just pick an answer. And then keeping it simple and low commitment like this early on helps to set the tone and lets people know that they'll be expected to engage. As the answers to your questions come in, you'll see a percentage of how many participants have already answered. and what percentage chose which answer. And then when you're wrapping up, you can also choose to share those poll results with your attendees. Having polls throughout the session can be a really good way to signal again that their attention and participation is not only welcome, but it's an integral part of your session. They're useful because they allow facilitators to ask participants to apply their learning during the session as it's going on. So to set up a poll during your meeting, you can do it by clicking on the polls option at the bottom, but that's only going to be present if you've already gone into your Zoom settings and enabled polls ahead of time. So this is one of those things where prep is also just as important, because the meeting, when you actually program it, you're going to have the option to turn polls on or off. And if you don't do that ahead of time, it won't be an option. Note too that you won't be able to use polls while your participants are already separated into their breakout rooms. That's a function that's usually only used when everybody's present in the main session. Just one last little comment about Zoom reactions, which is another really low commitment way to have people engaging with your session with these nonverbal cues for the facilitator. It can be encouragement, agreement, a raised hand, or a request to slow down.
Thank you so much, Amber. That's really helpful. Okay, perfect. So Isabel, can you chime in here?
I think I can, but I think it's Paula's turn.
Paula, okay, let's hear from Paula.
Fabulous. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you so much, Amber. We also use Zoom. So there is some, I'll try not to overlap too much with what you've just said. I agree with all of it. We haven't had quite the experience with the breakout rooms, but other features for sure. So I'm going to talk about three main things. The first is going to be in terms of creating engagement. I would invite you to think about how you're setting up the nature of your webinar. So there's the solo person webinar, there's what we're doing here, which is the multi-person with a host. And so when we've done our webinars, different types will work for different purposes. What we like to do is have a host. I'm the host. And then we have our guest. And what that allows is it allows us to have a conversation, which for some people might be, they may find it easier to follow, not always the case. It allows us to summarize information. So as a host, if the guest has explained something, I can recap some of what they've talked about. And that may be helpful for some of the members of the audience to kind of pick up on some of the key points. It sometimes puts the speakers at ease. I know in this dynamic as a speaker, I'm more comfortable because I can see my fellow presenters. In a webinar environment, if you're using Zoom at least, you cannot see the attendees. So we know you're there, but we can't see you. And so we're missing the feedback apart from what we see in the chat or in the Q&A. So it allows you to have that real-time feedback, which feels a lot more natural. It feels very unnatural if you've ever done a webinar where you're sort of launched into the webinar and you're talking, but you don't know, can people hear me? Is the volume right? So it creates additional comfort for the guests that we have on as speakers. And I think it also allows you to frame your webinar in a way that follows natural questions. So here, Hannah has created questions that might be the same questions that you as attendees have when you're creating your webinars. And so that allows for the people who are listening to engage with the content in a way that relates to them. So that's the first stage. The second is, Amber, you were talking about some of the Zoom functionality. We also use Zoom. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We use the Q&A in the chat. And like Hannah and like Amber suggested, we try to warm people up by asking them to do simple things that make them comfortable. So we would open up by saying, put your, please let us know where you're logging in from in the chat. That gets people comfortable with simply typing in, figuring out where chat is on their Zoom toolbar. And it allows us to have some information about the people who are logging in. So then we know where they're from. We can sort of speak to them in a way that we, the best that we can in a virtual environment. We also use and then we use chat as more for admin questions, tech issues. We also use the Q&A function in Zoom. And the Q&A function in Zoom has this lovely feature where you can upvote questions. So if there's a question up on the screen and everybody likes that question, they vote for that question floats to the top. So when you do get to your Q&A session at the end, you can start with those questions. Another thing that we have, which is a huge benefit, is we have a team. And so we have a team member who is doing the tech piece of it, which is enormously helpful. And then we've got a team member on chat and a team member on Q&A. And Amber, you mentioned that the Zoom rooms allow for somewhat of an in-person experience, or a replication of an in-person experience, that those breakout sessions. One thing that, so I was able to go to one in-person session before the pandemic struck. And what I noticed was that attendees liked to follow the speaker out of the room and ask all their personal questions. They really wanted that one-to-one attention. And so what we do is we have individuals, team members on the chat who are plugging in information as we go through the webinar. And so they have questions, they may get a hyperlink delivered to them in the chat. So we may not be able to get to all the questions in live with the speaker, but for the most part, people who tune in and put questions in the chat or put questions in the Q&A get some sort of a response from us. So it gives that extra touch point. And so that's the second point, is really using the chat Q&A. We also use polls to figure out who's in the room with us, which allows us to tailor the content to who they are. And so that third point is speaking to a way that empowers attendees. And we do that in 3 ways. Number one is we keep the conversation high level. We let our speakers know ahead of time. They don't need to go deep into the weeds to drag out all the specific statutes. It's really looking at high level. We can put the more detailed information into the chat for them. We also avoid slides that have too much text on them. So we like to have simple slides with questions. There's a wonderful TED talk about death by PowerPoint. You can look that up. All sorts of great tips on how to structure your slides. And then we try to offer information that empowers people to find that next step. And that next step might be that they know that they need to reach out to a lawyer for their question. It could be that there is a page on the website, your website, or another website that will offer them some additional information. Or it could be that they now feel more prepared to go into a conversation that they need to have. So those are the 3 things: the nature of how you structure your webinar, using the functions, whether it's chat and Q&A or something else, and then speaking in a way that empowers your guests. Thank you.
That's great, Paula. Thank you. And okay, Isabel,
Hey.
go right ahead.
Thanks. So I would like to highlight what Amber and Paula have just shared, but with other words. So first, it would be just to use participants' experiences. Ask participants what they know about the subject before bombarding them with legal information. Don't forget that people already have knowledge, skills, and experiences related to the subject. That's the reason why we ask you to describe what a good webinar looks like before starting the panel. Generally, it's easier to visualize and analyze what yourself have experienced. If their experience is taken into consideration, participants will easily be able to link your webinar subject to their own experience. So if you have one thing to remember is that you might be the legal experts, but they are the expert of their own experience, and both are necessary for success. Secondly, actively involve participants during the webinar. Amber and Paula already shared several really interesting and engaging techniques to encourage participation and interactivity during a webinar. What you should remember is that learning is the responsibility of both the facilitator and the learner. And often, like a lecture type webinar gives all the responsibility of learning to the learner, and it shouldn't be. There are some studies that show that people will absorb more information if they do more than just listen. In fact, participants attending lecture type webinar will remember almost 60% less information than with a participative type webinar. Therefore, what we call active pedagogy has a significant impact in terms of learning, both in the short and the long term. And there are many ways to actively involve people. It might answer this first question asked by one of our participants in the Q&A. So I highly suggest just this diversifying training techniques during one webinar. So it's a great way to keep people's attention, to catch their interest, and to reach people with different learning styles, because some people will need to write answers in the chat, others will need just the visual support, some will prefer to have an open conversation in breakout rooms. So the more you reach more people if you diversify the different training techniques. And there are like different interactive apps such as Mentimeter. I think that Nicole already talked about it in the chat. Thanks. And so that Mentimeter is an app that you can use to create like presentation with real-time feedback. For instance, for this webinar, we could have used Mentimeter live polls, quizzes, word clouds, or Q&As to actively engage you throughout the webinar. And I'm sure you have tons of really relevant and innovative experience relating to this webinar topic today, but we had so much to share. So we decided not to use Mentimeter for today. So another way to actively involve participants is to take a moment during the webinar, mostly at the end, to plan the implementation of what was learned. So we could ask participants how they will incorporate what they've learned into their lives. They could complete like the following statement, like after this webinar, I will, okay, and then they write an action. So, and who knows, we might ask you this question at the end of this webinar, so be prepared. So the questions identified by the participants, they don't need to be complicated, but they must be concrete. Like for this webinar today, like some examples could be like, after this webinar, I will develop a training outline for my next webinar. Good thing. After this webinar, I will contact Paula to learn more about marketing strategies to promote my next webinar. I will share key points with my entire team, etc. So these actions aim to develop practical skills. It is essential for participants to implement actions in order to reinforce and integrate learning. If new information is not applied or reused outside the workshop context, it will probably just be forgotten. And I'm pretty sure you remember or you don't remember a very theoretical class in university that would never ever translate into anything in your daily work. So if you had applied this new knowledge in a practical way, you might have benefited like from it more. Yeah. Wow, I respected my 5 minutes.
Great work. That's fantastic. Great tips from our panelists here for our section 2 or part 2 for during a webinar. And we're going to just jump right into part 3. We're going to just pose the question here. What is one thing that you do after your webinar is complete to benefit your audience and your organization? So that's our part 3 after webinar. Amber, what's your take?
So one of the really important things that we do at PLEAC immediately following our webinars and workshops is to send out an evaluation survey to all our participants. Ideally, that's going to happen that day, the day of, or the next day, because waiting too long can be really unhelpful. We want attendees' memories to be fresh. We want their input to be useful and constructive. And we also find that we get more responses when we send them out early. Waiting too long means that people might not remember the content, their minds have moved on, they have other priorities on the go, and they might not take the time to respond. So this does require some prep ahead of time. We have the survey prepared in advance and it's used across all similar sessions. So we would have one similar survey template for all our sexual harassment workshops, for example. And then we generate a unique link for that session to send out to the attendees as a follow-up in an email usually. After the survey has been built, it doesn't take much time to generate that unique link for a survey to go with each individual session, but we still don't like to leave it until after the session just in case anything could go wrong and creates a delay. Those surveys are crucial to inform our future webinars. So they help us gauge things like whether or not the participant thought it was too long or too short, if there was information that they had been hoping to get that maybe we didn't cover during the session, whether they felt engaged and respected by that particular facilitator. This kind of information is going to be really helpful on both a broad and a narrow basis. Narrowly, it can inform the way that we approach the information in a particular webinar. We might want to add more content, adjust the way that the content itself is delivered to better meet our goal of educating the public about a particular legal issue. Broadly, it can also help us inform future webinars and programs because our best practices can grow based on participant feedback. For example, in our family law workshops in the past, participant feedback helped us develop a system where we give people the option to request that they attend separate sessions from their ex if they both happen to have registered for the same session. It helps us gauge also whether a given facilitator is doing a good job engaging the audience or if we maybe need to revisit their strategy with them. Finally, evaluation surveys give us really important information about who actually attends our sessions and why, how they heard about us, what they took away from it. This is going to inform how we advertise in the future, and it gives us important information for the project's future regarding the success in both delivery of the workshops and the way that we're engaging publicly with getting the word out. So evaluation surveys are really important to the work we do here.
That's great, Amber. Thank you so much. Isabel, go ahead.
Thanks. I will jump in on just what Amber just talked about. So evaluation tools, like they are essential to improve the future webinars and to collect concrete results. But in addition, evaluation tools such as survey are a great way to strengthen participants' learning. Some question could contribute to reinforce knowledge. Like for instance, you could ask, what are the 3 key learnings, or what was most useful? How will you apply what you just learned? Also, one good way is to send, like has Amber said, a follow-up email either right after the webinar or 2 or 3 days after with additional tools. It could be like legal information guides, some online publication, a cheat sheet, etc. And who knows, like this email could even include like practical exercises, quizzes, infographics, or videos. Why is it so important to share additional tools with the survey? Actually, it's easy. It all comes to learning and pedagogy. So learning is about, creating connection in the brain. And the brain is full of neurons, right? And by sending tools after the webinar, you want to strengthen the connections creating during the webinar. So participants remember the information forever. So those additional tools, like I have different objectives. Like the first objective is to repeat the information. So to retain a concept, it needs to be repeated several times in different ways. So it helps like activate the same neurons, and quizzes are really good tools for that. Also, additional tools help to recover memory. So participants can remember key learnings if information is just structured in a variety of ways. So this is why like infographics are really good for that. And so for this webinar, we could send an email in tomorrow or in a week. And this email could include just like a quick survey as well as a short document summarizing the best practices shared today. And there could be like what kind of facilitator am I type of quiz, and all your answers could automatically like lead to easy ideas to improve your legal information webinars. Like no expectation. We might not send this kind of email because we haven't time to prepare that, but we could do that. And that would be like applying our best practices.
Great point, Isabel. That's great. Okay, and then Paula, let's go over to you just to repeat the question in case. What is one thing or several things that you do after your webinar is complete to benefit your audience and your organization?
Thank you so much, Hannah. And thank you, Amber and Isabel. I love everything that you shared. And Isabel in particular, I would like everybody watching to remember what we said forever. I love that, forever. We're going to make those neurons really, really strong, the neural connections. So the main point that I'd like to highlight is multi-purposing your webinar. Once we have created a webinar, we turn it into a YouTube recording, and Drew Jackson will edit it and make it even better, wonderful. And it goes up on YouTube. And with it, we then create a page on our website where we've kind of copied what podcasters do. We create show notes. So there's a summary of the different topics that we covered in the webinar, along with pinpoint sites in time. So if somebody coming to that page is interested in a certain topic, they can see where it was talked about and then go straight to that spot. And then what we do with, and then we also have links. So like I said earlier, we ask our speakers to go high level, and anything that's really detailed, we can then link to on that page. So we'll put all the relevant links into the notes that go on that page. And then we have reviews. We also collect information. We do surveys right after the webinars, and then we're able to use that information. So if there have been positive things, positive feedback, we'll share that on that page. And then that page goes onto the website, and then we share it. We share it on our email list. We share it on social media. We send it over to our speakers. And we have noticed that we especially on certain topics like wills and estates, probate, we'll see that there's quite a number of views of the recording, which is lovely. We've also done like content linking. So if you have a static page on your website that talks, in our case, about wills and estates, for example, maybe a question was addressed in the webinar, you can then link to a pinpoint in time to the recording. So that's another way to multi-purpose. And then the last thing that I wanted to say on this point is when it comes to that feedback that you receive, is to share it with your speakers. We do this, again, we are very lucky to have Drew Jackson, who puts together the feedback very quickly, and we are able to then, and I see he's just put a link in the chat to one of our pages that summarizes the information arising out of a webinar. But he gathers information about the webinar itself, and often there are some really lovely comments about the speakers themselves. And so we send that to the speakers as soon as possible. And our speakers are all volunteers, and I think what is really wonderful for them is to get that feedback, to see that the work that they've done has had such an impact on people, that it is appreciated, that what they've done really well in that webinar. So that's something that I think is really important, is to have that as a way to reach back and to thank your speakers. So multi-purposing your webinar is the takeaway for me for this follow-up piece. And thank you, Drew, for posting all that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Paula. That's fantastic. And everyone's input for part 3 was so helpful. And we've had Drew speak on a PLEAC webinar as well. So thanks for chiming in there and for the shout out on that one. So that's great. I'm going to go ahead and just screen share just as we finished wrapping up sort of some commentary here for part 1, 2, and 3 for before, during, and after a webinar. We made fantastic time. I just want to go ahead and shout out to the attendees today and essentially just get some input on what is one thing you'll apply to create or facilitate your next webinar. That's a question that I will sort of send out to the chat, to those attending. There is no right or wrong answer either. It's something that you just heard us talk about, of course, or otherwise. If there's anything that you've learned today, please feel free to send that in the chat. Perfect. Absolutely. Preparing breakout rooms in the Zoom setup. Just to add, as well as some highlights that were talked about today, is knowing your audience, identifying engaging speakers, the importance of plain language, the importance of relatability. Absolutely. I see in the chat, preparing a training outline. Absolutely. That was very important. Note that Isabel raised the importance of relatability. Yep, and I see adding program notes, content overviews, and time codes to your archived webinars and videos. That's fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. Yep, asking participants to share how they will implement what they've learned. Absolutely. This was all touched on today. The use of online tools as well. Mentimeter. We talked about breakout rooms, chat, polls, and of course, the importance of evaluation, surveys, social media, and other engagement tools. Yeah, participants. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think yeah. That's great. Take a look at how we can improve workshop series. I'm glad. That's fantastic, Nicole. Yep. Mentimeter, please definitely check it out. And I'm happy to send that around afterwards. Isabel's very happy about that. We're definitely Mentimeter fans.
I'm such a fan. Making sure that all my team use Mentimeter for those of my team who are listening.
So if anyone has Mentimeter questions, Isabel is your go-to. Absolutely. No, these are fantastic. Thank you to everyone chiming in the chat. Great. So we'll go right ahead and we'll go into our Q&A. We did have a question here that popped up earlier on in the Q&A section. If anyone has questions right now, please feel free to chime in as well. But I'll go ahead and read this out, and any of the panelists here, please feel free to chime in, everyone or just one of you, whatever works here. So I see a lot of consensus that webinars should be interactive, but there are many people, myself included, who don't like the pressure to participate as an audience member, especially if it was not announced upfront that there will be, for example, small group discussions. How do you manage or balance different learning styles, needs, and preferences among your audience? Thank you, and this has been great. Thank you for the feedback. So that's the question that's been raised. Anyone want to chime in sort of first on that?
Maybe the first thing I said is and we don't have the habit to do that even in Educalois, is maybe we could announce in advance which kind of webinar it's going to be. So if it's a participatory webinar, so people are prepared to participate and get involved into the workshop. So maybe that would be my first advice. And as I said earlier in the webinar, I think it's important just to diversify the different training techniques. So because in this, if you have, like now we are 27 people, maybe half of the people are need some visual support, some others need to participate, ask questions, to learn. So you want to make sure that you use those different techniques, like maybe 10 minutes of breakout rooms, and then 5 minutes of I don't know, individual exercises where they have to find the information on a website by themselves, and then you have a 10-minute just of visual, like a PowerPoint presentation. It's more demanding for the facilitator to prepare all this, but you make sure that you reach the different learning styles of the participants.
Great, Isabel. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I think I would echo everything that Isabel said, and then just also making sure that your facilitators know that flexibility is a priority. So never demanding that everybody turn their camera on, for example, and just saying, participate as you're comfortable. And if people aren't answering a question, not holding up the entire webinar by waiting for everybody to provide an answer, just kind of be flexible, let people approach on their own terms, and also make sure your facilitators are aware of that and are able to communicate that to participants.
That's great. That's absolutely great. Paula, did you want to chime in or?
Yeah, I'll chime in. Our webinars are typically to a large audience. We don't do the breakout sessions for that reason. What we have done is we solicit input and we go on that feedback. So we will get feedback about, for example, how much Q&A. So sometimes we've had sessions where there's been less Q&A and we've had a request for more audience participation. So then we try to accommodate what that need is. And we try to solicit information from people ahead of time about, what questions they might have. So we don't have that situation described here where it's not wanting to have that engagement. It's a true webinar style. And so if somebody wants to just simply watch, they don't have to participate, but we do give them that option of participating and try to find ways to facilitate that for them.
That's great. Those are great answers. Thank you so much for answering. For asking that question there and submitting that in the Q&A. We have another question in the chat actually from Nicole here. So we have some difficulty getting uptake on our evaluation forms. I share it during the talk, and then we ask our organization's host to share it with their team afterwards. Any tips or what are average return rates on evaluations?
I don't have any numbers in front of me to say what the average return rate would be, but I can guarantee you it's never 100% and it's never as many as we'd like. Like if I were to guess off the top of my head, I would say that like 60 to 70% would be a good return on an evaluation survey after a session. It's very rare that it's in the 80s or 90%, unfortunately. I find like the best that we can do is to let people know at the session that we will be sending out an evaluation survey so they know to check for it. Sometimes we found that they accidentally go to people's junk mail. So letting people know at the session to check their junk mail can sometimes help. The other bit is just kind of telling them why it's important to, you're never going to get 100% return on those surveys, but explaining to people how they inform these sessions that we, for us, we offer them for free. And this is an important tool for our funders, for example, can sometimes make people feel a little bit more invested in answering them.
And I would, oh, Paula, did you want to? No, okay. And maybe when you are, I would suggest while preparing your training outline, you can just decide to take a 5-10 minutes at the end for people to answer the survey live. It's still anonymous, but you're sure that people answer. Or even like you can, it's the conclusion part, you take 5 minutes for the survey, and then you continue to give other information afterwards, so you're sure that people don't leave before answering the survey. Yeah, but we do also have the same issue at our organization. People, if we send the survey like the day after, like I think maybe 50% of the people only answer, so which is not a good rate.
And Paula, just before you jump in, I was just going to address some of the things in the chat. Just we've had some luck with dropping the link to the survey into the chat in the last minute or two of the actual webinar, so people can click there immediately. And you're also sending it out in an email afterwards, which is a great point. We attach the survey directly to Zoom, which makes it appear on their screen upon exiting. Yep, those are all exactly. That's perfect. Great. And Paula, so chime in, and then we have another question as well.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, and thank you, because I agree with Amber and Isabel. Isabel, I love that idea of actually building the questions into the body of the webinar. Our survey comes up is through Zoom, and so it pops up right as attendees log out. And we like to let everybody know ahead of time. I think we mentioned it twice, once at the beginning and once at the end, that there is a survey. And as Amber suggested, we let them know what the benefit is for responding to the survey, whether it's producing more webinars like this to find out how we can make the webinars better for them. And we also highlight that the survey is short. I think it's 5 questions, so it isn't going to take them a lot of time, and that we really appreciate it. So they've had that heads up ahead of time that they know that they're going to be prompted at the end of the webinar. So those are some strategies that we have used that we think have been effective in soliciting responses.
That's great. That's great. I'm just going to jump. We do have just a few minutes left, so maybe let's try to get as many of these as we can. But I see here a question. So totally take your point about multi-purposing for Paula, the webinar. Curious to know how popular the recorded webinars are at People's, and specifically in comparison to the number of people who are signing up for the live webinar.
Thank you, Jessica, for that question. And I wish I had the exact numbers in front of me. I mean, they're publicly available, because if you go onto YouTube, you can actually see how many views there have been for each of the recorded sessions. For something like our probate webinar, it's a really, really popular topic. And I think if you go on there, I think it's got more than 1,000 views now. So there is quite a bit of uptake on the more popular topics. Some of the topics are less popular in the sense that they were point specific or point in time specific. And so like some of the employment webinars, maybe the information now has changed a little bit. But we certainly have, for some of them, a multiple of the live attendees. So it's nice to see as a provider that these resources are getting multiple views.
Thank you, Paula. And I'm just going to address, maybe we can answer this question in the Q&A here for post-webinar evaluations. What tool or tools are you using for sending them out?
So at PLEAC, we use an external evaluation company that actually helps us evaluate the delivery of our projects, as well as handles the evaluation surveys. And so they develop the surveys themselves, and we send them out. I believe it's a SurveyMonkey link.
And in Educadwa, we use Microsoft Forms to send evaluation surveys.
And I confess, I know we use Zoom, and Drew, who asked the question, would know better than me. I think we use Google Forms for the actual webinar review itself.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering that question there. I'm just seeing, obviously, thank you, Amber, for that addition to the chat there. Joel, thank you so much for all those kind words, of course. And Drew, I see, has addressed sort of Jessica, just on a little bit more of a, yep, you saw it, all good. Fantastic. Okay, so I mean, I think this is sort of where we're wrapping up here with just a minute left. Thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. This has been absolutely great today. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists today. As mentioned before, I just want to add as well, the link to the recording will be available. I know everyone is curious to sort of catch up or maybe review on some of these great tips. I know we had to go super fast, but that's what it is with squeezing everything in sort of a 60-minute block. But in a meta sort of way, hopefully we've showed what a good webinar can kind of look like, and we use some of the tools that we sort of discussed today in that sense. So if you're interested, of course, in connecting with any of our speakers today directly, they have so much more to share. We, obviously this was compressed to a place that we can get it today, but please feel free to send me an email. If that's the only contact you have. Isabel, thank you. You can drop that in the chat. Amber and Paula might do so as well, but I will send it out afterwards also. And feel free, either reach out to me or the speakers directly, or I will connect you if you have any other questions throughout, not just, just after the webinar here. And we're perfect on timing today. I'll just give everyone a huge applause on that today. That's always a little bit hard to do. And perfect. Thank you everyone for the nice feedback. I hope everyone learned a little bit more today. And that's it. We'll call it for today, and have a fantastic rest of your week. We're almost at Friday, and enjoy. Have a great time. Thanks for tuning in. Bye, everyone.
Bye.